Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and believe it or not, it's almost a year ago that we saw Nvidia launch Turing. The RTX 20 series, though, perhaps was not received as well as Nvidia had hoped, and that's a bit of an understatement. And there were three reasons behind this. The first of which was, well, software support. It's great and all that the cards supported features such as ray tracing and DLSS, and indeed there was a lot of hype and anticipation for the architecture prior to the final release of the graphics cards. Unfortunately, when we actually received them, software support was somewhat meager, and that's putting it very mildly. Even titles that was demoed at Nvidia's press events, such as Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we had to wait months before they finally launched the patches for the retail versions so that you could actually try it out on your card at home, which was definitely not exactly the best thing in terms of publicity for Nvidia. The second issue was the pricing, of course. The pricing of cards such as the 2080 and 2080 Ti, well, I think the best way of describing it was eye-watering. It was really expensive and it received a lot of criticism for both reviewers as well as end users. I was quite a fan of ray tracing and I did believe in its potential, and if you did not own a card such as a GTX 1080 Ti and you had something much slower, for example, you were still rocking a 980 and you were upgrading to, let's say, a 4K screen or a high refresh rate 1440p screen, then certainly picking up the newer generation GPU was a smart move unless you could get a really cheap Pascal GPU. Well, things have certainly changed in, around 10-11 months. And that is that, Nvidia have launched a refresh of Turing known as the Super series of GPU, although currently there is no Super RTX 2080 Ti. In my hand, I am holding the RTX 2070 Super. This is from MSI. This is a Gaming X Trio variant. So the good news is we see the same level of pricing, but the performance has gone up a tier. So in the case of the RTX 2070 Super, it's roughly on par with the RTX 2080. So let's take a look at the specifications and then go an overview of the Super series. A couple of months prior to the launch of Super, we released a video detailing what one of our sources had told us, that Nvidia were planning to launch a refresh of Turing, and it would sport faster memory clock frequencies compared to the originally released cards. Well, the good news is Nvidia did this, but also a lot more besides. So there are currently 3 cards in the Super lineup, although we wouldn't be surprised if we saw the RTX 2080 Ti Super launch in a couple of months. The first 2 cards we'll discuss are the RTX 2070 Super and RTX 2080 Super. These essentially replace the vanilla variations of the cards, and those GPUs are now end of line. The third card is the RTX 2060 Super, but this will act as a halfway house between the 2060 Vanilla and the RTX 2070 Super. Therefore, the RTX 2060 Vanilla will continue to be sold. Nvidia have ramped up the number of CUDA cores and clock frequencies for the Super GPUs, and in the case of the RTX 2080 Super, we also see the memory clock speeds have been nudged up as well, from 14 Gbps up to 15.5 Gbps. If we look at the specifications of the 2070 Super versus the 2080 and 2070 Vanilla, we can see the difference. The 2070 Super, I'm just going to refer to it as Super for now, is using the GPU core of TU104, which is the same core found in the 2080. The 2070 used TU106. We also see an increase in the CUDA core count from 2304 up to 2560, but we also see a higher clock frequency as well, with the base frequency now 1605 MHz compared to 1410. While the 2080 still has a higher CUDA core count compared to the Super GPU, we do see Nvidia have also increased the clock frequency over the 2080. So the RTX 2070 Super has a base frequency of 1605 MHz compared to 1515 MHz of the 2080, and the boost frequency is 1770 MHz versus 1710 of the RTX 2080. The pricing of the 2070 Super is identical to the vanilla RTX 2070 when it launched, $500 US, and the TDP of the card also remains the same, 215 watts. But what about MSI's RTX 2070 Super Gaming X Trio, other than being a mouthful to say? Well, first of all, like other cards in MSI's Gaming X Trio lineup, the cooler is not subtle and it is definitely not small. The card measures 12.9 inches in length, 5.5 inches in width, and as for the height, it is 2.22 inches. So this card is not designed for small form factor builds. The card also houses 3 fans, one smaller one at the rear of the card near the I/O, and also 2 larger ones. These fans use MSI's Torx fan technology with double ball bearings. The crux of the matter here is that unless you really turn the fans up to near 100%, you will not notice the card in operation, and given that the fans completely shut off, like a lot of modern GPUs when the card's running at lower temperatures, for example, you're on the desktop watching YouTube videos, or maybe a 3D game like, say, Quake 1 that isn't particularly taxing, the fans just won't do anything. The card is also outfitted with MSI's Mystic lighting, which is fully customizable via software, and there's also a hefty grey backplate as well at the rear. This is a very solid card. To be honest, if someone broke into your home and you needed something to use in place of a baseball bat, this card would probably do you just fine. As with all modern Nvidia GPUs, you can probably guess what the outputs are: 3 DisplayPort 1.4, as well as a single HDMI 2.0B, and the power connectors you're going to need 2 8-pin ones. As I mentioned, the TDP of this GPU is 215 watts, which is exactly the same as the Founders Edition. Speaking of comparisons to the Founders Edition, let's talk about clock frequencies. The Gaming X Trio still has 2560 CUDA cores, but MSI advertised the boost frequency to be 1800 MHz. This is compared to just 1770 MHz of the Founders Edition model. It's hardly a massive leap, but the advertised boost frequency is very conservative, and in reality, if we look at this graph, we can see what the actual clock frequency is. With stock operation, that is with no custom fan curve or any voltage offset or clock frequency offset, we can see that the GPU hovers between 1920 MHz to just under 1950 on average. Obviously, Nvidia's Founders Edition card also does boost as well, but without question, the Gaming X Trio definitely has a little more overhead, thanks to the, quite frankly, ludicrously sized cooler. But can we do better than this? And the answer is most certainly yes. We went into MSI's Afterburner, although of course you could use other applications such as EVGA's Precision X if you prefer it, and did a little bit of tweaking. After just a couple of minutes, I added 130 MHz to the core clock, 112% to the power limit, cranked the voltages up to 100 millivolts, not that it does anything, but it just made me feel better, and added a more aggressive fan curve. And just for the heck of it, I also added 960 MHz to the GDDR6 memory as well. I could actually go a little bit higher on the GDDR6, but I noticed after prolonged testing there would occasionally be the odd artifact. And what does that mean for performance? Well, quite frankly, it means that the clock frequency goes into the stratosphere. Over 2100 MHz can easily be sustained now, which is really good for frame rates, and we'll be going into that in just a moment. So now we're going to take a look at some benchmarks. We're going to be using an i7-8700K overclocked, and this is going to be the same system that we use to test our other cards, such as the RTX 2070 and RTX 2080, so we can get a nice point of comparison. I'd like to thank Deepcool for providing the Captain 240 Pro AIO cooler, as well as MSI for providing the MPG Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon AC motherboard that we're using for testing. So right off the bat, haha, we're using Batman Arkham Knight. Right off the bat, do you get it? Oh god. You can see a massive improvement in performance with the RTX 2070 Super. The RTX 2070 scores 71 FPS at 4K, whereas the 2070 Super is identical in performance to the RTX 2080, 82 frames per second, although it does dip a little bit compared to the 2080 at lower resolutions such as 1440p. With DLSS, the story is very similar. The RTX 2080 definitely does have a small lead over the RTX 2070 Super, but it's nowhere near as pronounced as the RTX 2070 Vanilla. 36 FPS for 4K compared to 30 FPS. We go from barely maintaining a playable frame rate to having a little bit left in the tank. The story is very identical for Assassin's Creed Origins as well. Maximum settings, of course, 52 FPS for the RTX 2070 Super compared to the RTX 2080, which scores 54 at 4K, or 47 FPS for the RTX 2070. And now for Lara's latest adventure, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, DirectX 12 with maximum setting, ray tracing is disabled, and at 1440p we have 83 frames a second with the 2070 Super, compared to 87 frames a second of the RTX 2080 or 74 frames a second for the 2070. Compare that to AMD's RX 480, which is definitely an older card now in the Polaris lineup, but still, and that manages just 35 FPS. So the previous benchmarks were using the built-in benchmark mode for the application or the game, so therefore the runs had as little variation as possible. The next 4 benchmarks though are done with manual runs. We did a couple of runs and then took the average. We're using Crysis 1, Resident Evil 2, Wolfenstein 2, and finally Witcher 3. With Crysis 1 we're running at 4K, with all the other games it's 1440p, again with the quality settings at max. There is one exception to that, and that is Resident Evil 2, where we chose the 2GB texture setting because lower end cards such as the GTX 980 we could see some texture swapping, and well, we didn't want to do that, we were testing pure rendering performance here. The manual runs tell very much the same story as the built-in benchmarking tools. The 2070 Super is virtually replacing the RTX 2080, and given the Gaming X Trio runs at higher clock frequencies, that's obviously benefiting the benchmarks we're seeing here. So how's about overclocking results? Earlier on I mentioned that I added 130 MHz to the core, 112% to the power limit, and 960 MHz to the memory, which meant that the GPU was running at around 2100 MHz, which is substantially increased over the factory default. So what does that do for performance? Well, in essence, very good things. Now, from a card that was being outperformed by the RTX 2080, it is now essentially neck and neck with the RTX 2080. In fact, in some applications, it's actually beating it. Like, for example, Superposition. With 4K optimized, it scores 9210 compared to the RTX 2080, which scores just 8619. What's that, Turing? I know. I know you want to be loved, it's okay. We're going to be discussing that now, okay? Alright. So what conclusions can we draw for the RTX 2070 Super? Well, it's great news if you're yet to jump into Turing. For the same price as early adopters were paying for their launch cards, you essentially get a GPU that is a higher performance tier. The RTX 2070 Super being the case in point here. The GPU is the same level in performance as the RTX 2080. There was a lot of criticism for the pricing of the GeForce RTX 20 series when Nvidia launched them late last year. And if they had launched them at this super performance, I suspect complaints around pricing would have been far less numerous. For the here and now, the RTX 2070 Super is a great buy, and in the case of MSI's Gaming X Trio, there's enough cooling headroom to crank the frequencies where it's virtually indistinguishable from an RTX 2080. We'll be reviewing AMD's RX 5700 series soon, and there's definitely a big debate on which is the better offering, AMD's cheaper cards or Nvidia's Turing GPU. But for those who want Turing's feature set or prefer Team Green or just have around $500 to spend, the RTX 2070 Super does make a very compelling case for itself. And from my point of view anyway, it is quite nice to mess around with ray tracing and DLSS, but that's not to say that you're going to go wrong by going the RX 5700 route either. Much like the RTX 2080 it replaces, I don't feel comfortable declaring this card as enough for 4K with all settings maxed out, although I guess you could certainly compromise some settings for 4K, but I think that this card is much more at home providing 1080p or 1440p experiences with high refresh rate, and therefore the RTX 2070 Super is perfect for that. Would I purchase Turing purely for ray tracing capabilities? No, probably not. At the end of the day, it's still very early, but I do feel that by next year, especially the latter part of next year, ray tracing will become very common. Personally speaking, I look at ray tracing as a nice optional extra. If you're spending several hundred US on a graphics card, I think that ray tracing is a nice feature to have. Not everyone likes it because of the performance here, and that is totally understandable. And if you play a game which requires fast reactions, such as Call of Duty Modern Warfare, frame rate is undoubtedly king. But for games like Control, for Cyberpunk, for Metro Exodus, I think that ray tracing adds a lot of atmosphere to the title. Would I buy a GPU specifically and solely because it has ray tracing? Not now in 2019. But as of the time I'm recording this, there are a lot more titles which do support ray tracing, and a lot of titles which are upcoming which support ray tracing. So my standpoint is, well, if you are spending a lot of cash on a graphics card, ray tracing is a very nice optional extra, and I suspect it's going to change significantly over the next several months. I'll be putting out a video which will be further investigating the performance of ray tracing pretty soon, so do stick around for that if you're interested. As for MSI's effort with the Gaming X Trio, just like other cards in the Gaming X Trio lineup, it's hard to find fault with the card, but I don't find it significantly innovates over, let's say, Pascal and the Gaming X Trio. Then again, it doesn't really need to. It does what it says on the tin, provides lots of overclocking headroom, quiet in operation, reliable, and just works. The only negative I have for this GPU, other than the higher pricing, is that it only has a 30 MHz advertised boost frequency over the Founders Edition model, which, despite the average clock speed did hit way higher than the Founders Edition cards of course, I feel is a bit of a missed opportunity, and would have been nice to see advertised boost speeds a little bit higher. For example, another 50 to 60 MHz would have been kind of nice, so let's say 1830 compared to 1770. But if you're in the market for an RTX 2070 Super and don't mind spending a few extra bucks on purchasing one card for better performance, then we'd definitely recommend MSI's Gaming X Trio as a card that you should consider. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you did, then consider subscribing to the channel and also dropping a like on this video because it helps us out a ton. And I hope you have an amazing day. So take care of yourselves. Bye for now.